Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Heather Hansen, and we are continuing to cover this really interesting case against Tex McIver. I'm really looking forward to talking to our guest during this lunch break about what happened this morning and what happened yesterday, and whether or not the prosecution has actually met their burden thus far. I know a lot of you who are watching are thinking that maybe that's not the case. So I want to bring in first Dan Schorr, our guest who has been here a couple times, is a former prosecutor and an attorney to have this conversation with. Good afternoon, Dan.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back.
So good to see you. But I also want to bring in Charles Mittelstadt. Charles is here with us via Skype, and we want to talk to him as well about the testimony that we've heard thus far and what exactly this is going to sort of lead to as we talk about the forensics. Good afternoon, Charles.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I am great. So, gentlemen, I want to start with you, Charles, and then I want to go to Dan. What do you think thus far about the prosecution's case? How are they doing with really establishing the intent that they need to establish in order to meet their burden with the charges they brought?
Well, you know, this is actually a very challenging case, both for the prosecution and for the defense. If you can really split it into two parts. If you look at the physical evidence, the scientific evidence, the ballistic evidence, there's nothing that precludes the possibility that this was accidental. You're not going to hear from any expert who's going to come in there and say that evidence eliminates that possibility. So really it comes down to getting into Tex's mind. And for that, we rely on the testimonial evidence and also the circumstantial evidence. What we haven't heard so far is we haven't heard any sort of real compelling evidence, such as maybe that there's some browser history whereby he researched staging an accidental shooting. We haven't heard that there was an affair. We haven't heard a lot of the things that would make it very easy for this jury to make a decision. So far it's been very nuanced, and I think a lot of their prosecution witnesses really haven't delivered yet. We heard from the doctor Dr. Kegler, who denied hearing this notion that Tex was trying to get Diane to take the position that she had actually placed the gun in her own back or behind her and it accidentally went off. And then also Alan Stringer yesterday essentially completely knocked the legs out from the prosecution's claim that there was any sorts of issues other than absolute love between these two individuals, or there was anything nefarious going on or anything different on that particular day.
Right.
So it's been challenging.
Charles, I want to come back to you about the forensics because I think that's going to be an important part of the case. But before I do, Dan, what do you think, as Charles just mentioned, the jurors really have to get in Tex McIver's mind. Do you think he will testify? This is a question that was being bandied about on the chat rooms today. It's something that I know that we always talk about when we're talking about this type of case. What do you think is going to happen in this particular case?
Right. We talked about this last week before the trial started, and I said I think it's a wait-and-see approach for the defense. Does the prosecution make out the case beyond a reasonable doubt in the defense's mind, and then they make a decision to testify? Right now, I would say no.
Right.
The defense is going to say, is it worth taking the stand? Because there are problems with Tex McIver testifying. He might have a motive to kill his wife. He's made inconsistent statements. He allegedly told people to change their story. That's all going to look bad on cross-examination. But if the prosecution hasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he intentionally killed his wife, which right now looks like they haven't, I don't think you take the risk of putting him on the stands. But the prosecution hasn't rested yet, so they may provide more evidence.
I don't disagree with you, Dan, but Charles, what do you think about this? I do get the sense that Tex McIver is a bit of a control freak. I think that he tried to control the witnesses, he tried to control the circumstances, and having been an attorney for so long, I think that maybe he wanted to make things look the way he wanted them to look. Do you think that that will sort of play into whether or not he pushes his attorney to let him testify?
I don't think it will at this stage. I agree, and in fact, I think he got himself here. Yeah. Originally, this case was charged appropriately as a manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, reckless conduct case. It's only through his own mouth or his words and his attempt to control the narrative that he got himself here. He has an entirely new defense team now. He obviously realizes that the stakes are much higher. He put himself in this situation. So I would imagine that he's going to follow advice of counsel at this point, and also the fact that a lot of the heavy lifting has really been done for him at this stage. I mean, through Alan Stringer, we really got to hear what his testimony would have been or would be without subjecting himself to cross-examination.
Yeah.
The same is true with Danny Joe Carter. We've learned a lot about what he would say.
And I think that that's a fabulous point, Charles. You know, we see this, Dan. I know that you and I both did some work with the Zimmerman case. And when you can get what the testimony would be in through other witnesses or through some sort of interview or some sort of video, that's great for the defense because then you don't have to call your witness. Now, do you think that Danny Jo has been helpful in that regard thus far?
You know, it's an unusual prosecution witness because she doesn't really help the prosecution the whole way. She's not saying that it was an intentional shooting, and I can't think of any specific facts she's alleging that really say beyond a reasonable doubt this must be intentional, and she's the only other person in the car at the time. So it wasn't a great witness for the prosecution. She doesn't clear the defendant either, but she doesn't have to clear the defendant for the defendant to win on it. She's a crucial witness for the prosecution. If she doesn't get them close or all the way to beyond a reasonable doubt, it's hard to see how that the prosecution makes that case with other people.
Yeah, and it's interesting to watch, Charles, because Bruce Harvey, who is the defense attorney who's cross-examining Danny Jo, is not being super aggressive and is not doing any sort of gotcha moments. It seems like he's just slowly and surely and a little bit repetitively leading her through her day. Do you think that's because he knows that she is not out to hurt his client?
I don't think there's any reason to attack her at this point.
Right.
I mean, she's really not being adverse in any sense. So far, from what we heard from her on direct, there's really nothing that is overly damaging. There's again, the stuff that's most damaging in this case has to do with the things that came out of McIver's mouth himself. And so they're going to have to try to frame that differently and going to have to try to minimize some of the effects of this and explain some of that away. But overall, she's not necessarily a hurtful witness, so I don't see any reason to treat her like she's an adverse witness.
And if I could add something to that,
absolutely.
Usually in cross-examination, you're trying to show either the person's lying or they're incorrect. So you're saying you don't have all the information or you're making conclusions that don't follow from the facts. But there's nothing about her testimony that defense wants to say, aha, she's wrong about this. She's either lying or she's incorrect. So you don't have to be hostile. You don't have to be aggressive.
I agree completely. And to Charles's point, I do think when we get to the part where she's saying that McIver told her to say certain things, that she wasn't in the car, for instance, perhaps the cross-examination will get a little bit more aggressive. What do you think about that, Charles?
I think that's possible. I think they're going to try to get her to back off of some of the inferences, some of the conclusions that maybe she formed, and get her to perhaps accept that maybe she doesn't have a full recollection and maybe things could have been said a little differently or perhaps even in a different context. And that she can't possibly place herself in his mind when he said those things, and that everybody reacts differently to stress and to loss and those sorts of notions.
Yeah, and I think you're completely correct. And when we come back, right now I want to show our audience a clip of the cross-examination from this morning. This is Bruce Harvey cross-examining Danny Jo Carter and sort of get the nuance of how this cross-examination is going on. And then when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about forensics.
It was probably more. It was more than a year. Somewhere maybe 2.
After they first met?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall what year they moved in together? They knocked out the wall, right?
Yes.
They expanded the single condo, correct?
Correct.
They expanded it into 2 adjoining, and not condos, but 2 adjoining spaces. Would
Yes.
that be fair to say?
Yes.
And they then started like living together, right?
Yes.
Okay. Diane was working this entire time at Corey, correct?
Correct.
You were still part of their, I guess, group, their friendship group. You and Tex and Diane were a pair, a threesome that did things together. Correct?
Yes. Yes.
All the time.
Yes.
And it was a regular occurrence that you and Tex and Diane would do things together. Right?
Yes.
All right. And I guess their relationship moved on to the point where they finally decided, we're going to get married.
Yes.
Tex wanted to, in the way that he is, you understood that he wanted to kneel down in the woods and get on his knees and propose to Diane, correct?
Yes.
And he wanted to propose to Diane in a romantic setting, out in the woods, in a place that they loved. That was out at the ranch, right?
Correct.
Okay. And Tex, he wanted it to be as romantic as humanly possible, as he could make it, right?
Right.
And he wanted you to help him actually pick out or design a setting for the wedding ring that he was going to give to Diane.
Yes.
And you agreed to do that.
I did.
Okay, so you knew that things were progressing and they were walking towards this romantic proposal and this marriage, correct?
Yes.
But, this was at a time that you told us that you were drinking.
Yes, that was before I quit.
Yeah. You
Yes.
understand where we are in
Yes.
time, right? Mm-hmm. We're in time right now before the wedding, correct? And you knew them when they were living together. The relationship was a close one with you three. You were doing things together, but because of your drinking, that stopped, didn't it?
Yes.
All right. In other words, Diane cut you off, is what you told us, I think, yesterday.
She distanced herself from me.
Distanced herself. She wasn't going to see you anymore. She didn't talk to you anymore. Y'all didn't do anything together. In fact, you had no contact whatsoever at that point where Diane McIver said, I'm not talking to you anymore. I don't want to be around you. We're not doing anything together anymore. Right?
She said she distanced herself from me.
Right. And did you talk with her after that? Did you go to the ranch after that?
I did not.
Did you do anything with them once she said, I'm going to distance myself from you?
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Heather Hansen, and that was a little piece of the cross-examination this morning by Bruce Harvey of Danny Jo Carter. That piece was a little bit confusing to me, Dan. He's talking about the fact that Diane had sort of distanced herself from Danny Jo during the time that she was drinking. Why do you think he needed to establish that to then get into what happened afterwards when they reunited?
It's really unclear. He's going through a lot of details about their day and their relationship together and I guess how close they were, and that may be relevant to what she might have told her at different points, but I don't think any of it is really speaking to the greater issue here, which is whether the murder was done intentionally or not. I think it's more about trying to understand the relationship and what information might have been passed back and forth between them.
Right. I mean, what happened that day is really the key. And I guess to establish motive, Charles, they're trying to get into some of the things that had happened before. But do you have a sense that anything about the estrangement, the fact that Danny Jo and Diane had spent a period of time where they weren't in touch, whether that has anything really to do with the claim here made by the prosecution?
Perhaps I think maybe a couple of things could be going on, Heather. One is I think it's important, especially when you start a cross-examination, to establish, I know as much about this as you do, and we know a lot more about you than you think we know. So that kind of puts the witness on the defensive immediately, and it may force them to be a little more accurate in their recollections. And also, if they don't remember something, perhaps not to assume that they do or even guess at things. And then also, perhaps later, it may help them be able to argue that, listen, there were certain aspects of their relationship that Danny Jo simply didn't know because there was this period of estrangement. So perhaps that's what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense to sort of put a witness on shaky ground if you're planning to go after them. But thus far, that has not happened. But I really want to move into talking about the forensics a little bit, because thus far, Charles, we haven't heard from a forensic expert. But we have heard a lot of references to the gun being in a plastic bag and how much force it would take to shoot the gun, and whether it was a hair trigger gun, and this issue between single and double, and then also which way the gun was facing. What do you expect that we'll hear in the prosecutor's case about the forensics here?
Well, we know from their opening argument that they have thrown out this 12-pound trigger statistic or figure, and that's actually not entirely accurate. So what we're dealing with is it's a Smith & Wesson 38 caliber revolver. It's a model 638, which is both single and double action. And so what that means is in the single action mode, it's one, the trigger is one pull, and then in the double action mode, it's another pull. The double action mode is actually where it is the 12 pounds. And the single action mode, it's as little as about 4. And I understand that there may be testimony in this case that the trigger was even lighter on this exact weapon. And that's really a hair trigger. I actually did a little research on this weapon, and there's all sorts of reviews online about this weapon, and almost unanimously everybody talks about how, again, in the single action mode, how the trigger is almost too light. And so it has this shrouded. Another unique feature about this gun is it has a shrouded hammer, and that's because it's a true carry conceal gun. And what that means is the hammer doesn't protrude like most revolvers, and it's designed to be able to, you can put it in your pocket or your purse, and things aren't going to get caught on the hammer itself and accidentally cock the gun. And so what the defense is invariably going to argue in this case is that when the gun was handed back to Tex, is that it was already cocked in the bag, and therefore we're dealing with the lower trigger pull figure, not the 12-pound trigger pull, because I don't think it's conceivable that you can accidentally pull a 12-pound trigger, whether you're going over a bump or not.
Well, and that's sort of going to be the point, right? Do you have any expectation, Charles, and then Dan, I want to talk to you about how lawyers handle this stuff, but do you have any expectation that we'll hear from the prosecution expert that it was on the double, so that it would have taken the 12 pounds? Because that evidence would certainly establish the idea of intent. If they're able to have an expert come in and say, when I examined this gun, it was clear to me that it was on the 12-pound as opposed to the 2 to 4 pound.
I don't see how it's possible for anybody to make that sort of observation. It's, once the gun's been fired, then it's automatically in the single action mode. So there really isn't any way for that to take place, as far as I know.
Yeah, Dan, it's so important, the experts in these cases. And, I just had a case last week, and we had our expert, and the other side had their expert, and it really was a battle of the experts. And the argument that you make is that your expert's better, more credible, more academic, more credibility because they've been doing this for longer, or doing it better, or doing it at better places. But if you've got one forensic expert who's going to say that, yes, to Charles's point, that if no one can tell, then maybe they'll be able to say, well, it seems to me that perhaps it was in the 14-pound. But is that going to be enough if you can also attract that person's credibility in some way?
Well, it's a tough case for the prosecution, because even if they can show, well, maybe it was in a state that made it harder to pull by accident, that's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So the prosecution's going to have to say, look at that fact, look at his motive that he could financially gain, look at the fact that he allegedly coached witnesses to lie, look at the fact that he gave different stories. Altogether, this points beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed intentional murder. But right now, it's hard to pull that all together for that picture to say beyond a reasonable doubt. But they're not done yet. But alone, they don't have an expert saying, well, this could only have been pulled intentionally.
Yeah, it's Charles, I have another question about the gun and wanted to see, especially since you've done all this research on the gun. It seems to me as though the prosecution wants to say, I don't know that they've actually said it, that the gun was not on its side, but rather facing upwards, whereas the defense, of course, would rather have the gun sort of laying on its side on his lap. Is there a way to tell whether the gun was facing a certain way when they're doing the forensic investigation after this incident?
Well, the problem is it was in this plastic bag. So any gunshot residue conceivably will have been contained within that bag. If you look, the other way to try to extrapolate is based upon the height of the back seat and also the entry hole in the, when I say back seat, the seat that Tex would have been seated on, versus the driver's seat and the backrest where the entry hole would appear. Is that consistent with where Tex's lap, based upon the appropriate height, or is it more consistent with the gun having been raised? So I don't think you're going to be able to rely on gunshot residue. But to the earlier point of, whether it was in the single or the double action mode, what the prosecution is going to argue is, look, here's a guy who was very familiar with guns, and we've heard all this testimony about them shooting all the time, going to the range, etc., and how it's inconceivable that somebody with that sort of gun knowledge would have a cocked gun in a bag in his console. And that to me is the reckless part, right? That's why this case was originally charged the way it was, is because it is reckless. It is negligent to have a cocked, loaded gun in a bag in a console.
Yeah, it's. I think that we all agree, and I've talked to Dan a little bit about this, and you've mentioned it, Charles, that this case seems to be overcharged, to say the least. I want to go back and show the audience a little bit more from this morning and the cross-examination of Danny Jo Carter, because she really is the key witness for the prosecution, at least from a storytelling point of view. Some of these experts that we're going to be hearing from a little bit later may be key from an evidence point of view. But let's listen to a little bit more of the cross-examination, and when we come back, I want to talk to you guys a little bit how politics is going to play a part in this trial. But first, some of the cross-examination from this morning.
And in fact, you had known her for years and years at that point.
Yes, I had.
And you had become what you described as her best friend at that point.
Yes.
You had helped Tex McIver get the wedding ring and get the setting together. And Tex, had told you about how he was going to propose, right?
Yes.
But the distance between you and Diane at that point was so great that you weren't even invited to the wedding.
Yeah, we just did. We never spoke again after the phone call.
So the answer I understand is you weren't even invited to the wedding, correct?
Yes.
And you didn't go to the wedding, correct?
I did not go.
Okay. So as of about 2000, and this was 2005 or 2006, it's 2005 when this distancing occurred, correct?
September
of 2005. The wedding was in November of 2006. Am I correct about that?
No.
Correct me then, please.
I think it was in 2000. The wedding was in 2005.
Okay, the wedding was in 2005.
The distancing was the September before the
wedding.
Before the wedding.
Okay.
In November.
So then it would be November of 2005. And you didn't get to go to the wedding. And you didn't talk to her in 2005, right? You didn't talk to her in 2006, correct?
Correct.
You didn't talk to her in 2007, correct?
Correct.
You didn't talk to her in 2008, correct?
Correct.
And it is your recollection, as I understand it, that sometime around 2009 or 2010 is when you got undistanced, you got reacquainted, you got back together again.
Yes.
And that was after, was it not, Diane became convinced that you had successfully kicked the alcohol habit. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So I understand that Austin was born in 2006, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the year that Austin was born, you were estranged from Diane McIver.
Correct.
And for several years after that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you also understand and understood that Diane McIver kept her finances separate from Tex's finances, or you just didn't even know?
I did know that.
Okay. So Diane had her own financial interests. They were kept separate from Tex. And you know, she was pretty private about her own financial interests,
yes.
Right? And she was very, very, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but she was committed to making sure that her financial interests were protected, correct?
Yes.
No matter what else happened, no matter who else was involved, she was very good at doing that, correct?
Yes.
Right. And during this particular period, you didn't have any idea, because you were estranged from Diane, what they were doing as a result of the birth of Austin, correct? What they were doing financially.
No.
You didn't know. But when you got back together with them, with at least Tex, Diane, when you got back with Diane, you also got back with Tex, right?
Correct.
Right. There was really no separating Tex and Diane. They were together, maybe except for in financial matters, but it was always Tex and Diane, or Diane and Tex.
Yes.
Right? Okay. That came back together because when you were doing social things, it was always at that particular time Diane and Tex. Right?
Right.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Heather Hansen here with Dan Schorr, and we have Charles Mittelstadt on the line as well. And I want to talk a little bit about politics. You wouldn't think politics would be a big part of this case, Dan, but it has come up a lot on cross-examination. Bruce Harvey keeps talking about how passionate, and he's actually used words that he's then backed off on, like he gets angry and he gets passionate when talking about politics. How do you think that plays with the jury given the political climate right now?
It's interesting because the date of this alleged murder is September 25th, 2016. So that's the heat of the presidential election. So obviously that was on everyone's mind at the time. Now, how it plays into their theory, I'm not sure yet. Is he trying to win sympathy with jurors that might be of the same political persuasion? Is there some other angle? That's really not clear yet, but certainly this date is a very hot date for politics, and he's trying to bring that into the conversation.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, Charles, because, you know, if I'm presenting a case, I do not, especially given the political climate, especially given the way that some people feel so strongly, I don't want to talk about what my client's politics are at all. And yet here, it's come up more than once that he was very, very into politics. Now, he hasn't said who he was a fan of at that time. Right. You can sort of make some assumptions, maybe. The jury certainly, I think, would be making assumptions. What do you think of all this?
You know, I'm like Dan, I'm not quite sure where they're going with that, and I think it is a kind of a tricky landscape. So it's still not clear to me exactly why there's so much significance being placed on that.
Yeah, I think it's something to watch. It's an interesting issue because we know that during jury selection, Dan, Black Lives Matter came up, and they were asking the jurors how they felt about that because apparently Tex had said some negative things about that organization. I have to imagine if Bruce Harvey, he is a well-known attorney, he has a fabulous reputation. I have to imagine that if he planned to go into any political argument the way that he sort of has started to step into, he asked the jurors about their political leanings, or at least got a sense of it. But it's dangerous stuff, isn't it, to start getting into these sort of outside issues that are so important to so many people right now.
Right. And of course, as a prosecutor, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to every single juror. From a defense perspective, you're trying to get one or two jurors to not convict. So maybe he got a read on one juror through something in jury selection.
That's a great point.
And he thinks, well, these two people, if I could connect with them politically, I don't think they're going to convict my client. Maybe something like that. It's hard to tell.
That's a great point.
But as you said, he's an experienced lawyer, so he doesn't do things like accidentally like this.
Right.
So there's got to be a motive behind this. What's he thinking? I don't know. And certainly September 2016, you know what political stuff was going on then. And he's trying to bring that in here somehow. Without
a doubt, none of this is by accident. Every single word that comes out of his mouth. You know, I often talk to people about how trials are theater. And every word that's coming out of Bruce Harvey's mouth is well thought out, I'm sure. Now, the one thing that we haven't talked a whole lot about, Charles, that I want to make sure I address with you, and I think you brought it up a little bit earlier, this issue of coaching witnesses. Because that's another claim against Tex. It's another thing that he could go to jail for, and that is telling people to change their stories. That's come out a little bit with Danny Joe, but how much more of that do you think we're going to hear, and how much do you think, to me, that's where the prosecution's made their best points thus far?
I think so. I think that's as far as the defense case, that's really kind of the Achilles heel is, again, the defendant's own conduct. And this is not something that's unprecedented. I've had clients, attorney clients before as defendants, politicians, generally people who are in positions of power or great orators who are used to talking are the ones who most think they can talk their way out of something. And so it's not necessarily that it's that there's responsibility or necessarily guilt, but I think sometimes an attorney can overthink the perceptions of a case. And also, Tex may have had a lot of guilt with regard to, accidentally shooting his wife. And so, a lot had been made of the fact that he called his attorney to the hospital. To me, that's a completely logical and responsible thing to do from somebody who operates in the legal field. I understand and I think that way because I also know that, the criminal justice system is administered by human beings, and you have people who make mistakes, whether that be cops or a judge who makes a bad ruling or a prosecutor who engages in misconduct or overplays their hand or jurors who make the wrong, reach the wrong verdict. And so nobody, especially somebody in Texas' shoes with his background, takes for granted the fact that things are going to work out the way they should work out, even if he's completely innocent. So that's something that's I think is going to be one of the more important aspects of this case that the defense has to relate to the jury. They have to get them to understand that notion, because otherwise, if they fail to, I think that becomes very problematic. You can even see when you're looking online at some of the reactions to the live coverage, a lot of it centers around this very issue.
Yeah, I mean, Charles, I could not agree with him more. I think that as attorneys and as people in the system, we do see when the system sometimes doesn't work the way that you might have thought it would work. And also, we try to control the story, just as Bruce Harvey's doing throughout the course of this case, the prosecutor as well. And so it is sort of natural, I would think, for someone who's been working as a lawyer for as long as Tex McIver has, to try to control the story. But Dan, that attempt at control could be his downfall in at least some of these charges.
Right. So as an attorney, and even if you're not an attorney, you can't tell a witness to lie when there's going to be some criminal proceeding going on. So he's charged with 3 counts of influencing a witness. Those are separate counts that he can be convicted for and hypothetically put in jail for. So the defense has an interesting strategic decision to make. Do we acknowledge that he told people to say something that wasn't true and thereby leading to him being convicted of those counts, but saying there's an innocent explanation for it, like he was just trying to control the process, he was nervous? Or are they going to dispute those counts too? And then they may look like they're disputing things that are obvious, that other witnesses are making really powerful testimony about, that he told them to say things that weren't true, and that's going to make him look even guiltier. And then the prosecution can say, look, he killed his wife, and the biggest evidence is that he told people to lie, and he even won't acknowledge it now. Why would you do that if it was an accident? So I think it's going to be tough to maneuver that for the defense.
I agree with you 100%. I think that you've got it right on, that this is going to be the issue, because if he admits to telling people to change their story, it supports the prosecution. But if he doesn't, it seems like this is the one area where the defense attorney is going to have to strongly cross-examine these people. And it would be different if it was just one person who said, yes, he tried to influence me. But when you get to 3 people who say it, it really is a very difficult thing to overcome. Charles, what do you think is the method here? Do you think Bruce Harvey goes in hard on cross-examination with these people, or that he continues to sort of pussyfoot it? Well, how do you think he's going to handle that, at least as it comes to Danny Joe?
I think you really have to finesse it. I don't think there's going to be any real strong arming of these witnesses. I think you're going to have to try to thread a needle with each one of them. Again, the problem is what we have now is a pattern of conduct, right? There's multiple witnesses that are essentially saying very similar things. And so, there's that old adage, you can kill each one off one at a time, figuratively, not literally, but then you could drown in dead bodies. And that becomes the problem here. Yeah,
it's definitely going to be a tightrope that the defense has to walk. I know, Charles, that you have to leave us now, so we want to thank you so much for your insight and your expertise. It's enormously helpful, especially with regards to these guns. We're going to throw to another clip of the cross-examination. Charles, we'll have you on again soon, I'm sure. When I come back, I'll be here talking more about this with Dan.
Right.